Hello. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conference, and I think that this particular event confirms the fact that the renewed interest in postmodern architecture, and its legacy. And the sad fact is that it is sometimes mentioned in the context of reconstructing beyond recognition of some of the most striking examples of postmodernism, as it was mentioned before, or even its demolition. Nevertheless, at the same time, it's being appreciated, even listed and protected. One such example is Hermes Bank building in Vilnius, which 6 months ago was inscribed in a national heritage list and was awarded a state protection. And this citation mentions that, and I quote, Hermes Bank building is one of the first luxurious bank buildings among the new architecture of Vilnius and one of the best surviving examples of postmodernism. So, since postmodern architecture is officially legitimized and became an established cultural heritage, it looks like a perfect time for discussing this recent period in Lithuania, stretching back to the late socialism. Architectural history textbooks assert that postmodernism began in the 70s as a critical reaction to modernism, and it is often described as an architecture of late capitalism, which was closely associated with the economic boom of the 80s. While analyzing architecture in Soviet Lithuania and Soviet space, one can find a substantial number of postmodern sites and buildings which were designed and built almost in synchrony with the Western examples. And in that case, what could be the stipulations and the conditions for postmodernism during late socialism, and what values could Soviet postmodernism possibly represent? One possible answer could be suggested by looking into recent interpretations of modernity, which encompasses a lot of its aspects, postmodernism included. The 20th century has seen the rise of an interest in following diverse trajectories in order to challenge the idea of a single universal modernism and to reinterpret modernity, that is, to allow the other culture or space a role. Many studies have picked up a multifaceted reading of modernity as alternative, entangled, local, indigenous, enriching our understanding of modernism. So, isn't this the case with postmodernity and postmodernism? I would suggest that postmodernism as being connected to modernism could be described in terms of multiple postmodernities. And respectively, postmodern architecture in Lithuania under state socialism can be interpreted in two ways. For one, this tendency was clearly born outside the Soviet system, so the postmodern discourse is an example of circulation and dissemination of global architectural ideas. On the other hand, it has arrived at the exact moment when it could reinforce local cultural development and was following a trajectory of its own. Postmodernism in Lithuania has reached its peak in the 80s, as demonstrated by the catalogs of young architects published between 1983 and 1988. And these catalogs were showcasing the first buildings by young architects, mostly unimplemented projects, and almost all of these projects were featuring some postmodern compositions, elements, details, but not only the aesthetic features are important while identifying the chronology of architectural postmodernism in Lithuania and more generally in Soviet space. And this comparative graph shows the aesthetic, sociocultural, and historic chronology of postmodernism. And while aesthetically postmodernism has followed the tendencies of late modernism and regionalism, but from the socio-cultural perspective, in Soviet context, it is connected to the tendencies of rebirth of the national forms and re-Europeanization, and from the historical perspective with the period of stagnation and later the national revival. So I will be focusing not on pure aesthetical or stylistical qualities, but on more general social and cultural context, and how particular tendencies and buildings represent the epoch, and also how specific architectural themes inherent to postmodernism, namely that of history, context, and meaning, were represented. So postmodernism claimed to reinterpret tradition and to get over elitism, not by dropping it, but rather by extending the language of architecture into the vernacular and towards the tradition. And in Lithuanian architecture of late Soviet period, it meant ethnographic silhouettes, forms, elements, which were perceived as a counterbalance to the seemingly insensitive functionalism. So in some aspects, regionally inflected architecture like vacation complex Treva or another vacation complex Horizontas in Palanga clearly took local vernacular context as a reference, but these buildings might not be necessarily postmodern, but rather an oscillation between modernity and tradition. But on the other hand, well, I can't help comparing them to the sensibilities, for instance, of the Sea Ranch condominium by postmodern architect Charles Moore. And these tendencies, sometimes called proto-postmodern or folkloric regionalism, first emerged in recreational architecture and later in various public buildings like offices, vacation complexes, and even ritual architecture. And another context for that kind of expression was rural setting, and especially a specific typology of a cultural center, since Lithuania was largely an agrarian country during the mid-war, and the Soviet period is distinguished by modernization of the countryside and forced amalgamation of singular farmsteads into bigger kolkhoz settlements. And kolkhoz infrastructure became powerful and rich enough to hire or even employ full-time the architects of their own. And the competition between kolkhoz settlements produced some rather exuberant, slightly manneristic, and sometimes very sophisticated architecture which was being inspired by folkloric imagery. And these tendencies, I think, were part of a bigger phenomenon that cultural historian Violeta Dovolute has called the rustic turn, and I quote, "It was conceptualized as a broad cultural reaction to the failure of Soviet modernity, which gathered speed through the 70s and was expressed as a return to the rural, pre-modern roots of identity. It began as a vague sense of nostalgia for the lost way of life and grew into a political explosive discourse of collective trauma. The same feeling of separation and loss was felt throughout the Soviet Union as the leap from pre-modern agrarian way to the life of modern industrial existence in the metropolis occurred over the space of one single generation." And the term of the rustic turn suggests that architecture was part of a bigger cultural phenomenon, including at the time the establishing of ethnographical societies, folkloric ensembles, and the tendency of rural prose in literature, and so on. So progressive and futuristic impulses of socialist modernism were overturned by the return to the past, which was associated with nonconformism and a skeptical view of modernization. So buildings and architecture, in fact, were suitable instruments for the construction of fictional collective identities and the promotion of regional separatism, as the Soviet system was able to promote and accommodate the trends of regionalism and contextualism, as in the famous ideology of national in form and social in context. Another feature or trope of postmodern architecture in Lithuania, historicism and the sense of place, was also an important element of the architect's repertoire in the 80s. And historical references were represented in buildings of various typologies like offices, administration buildings, theaters and museums, apartment buildings. And again, the architects took this kind of rhetoric to the countryside and kolkhoz settlements, which where administration buildings, libraries, cultural centers were built like small castles or manor houses and have acquired some rather extravagant forms. So it's a public center built in the settlement of 200 people, I guess. But first of all historical elements were connected to the discovery of the historic city and were a reaction to the post-war transformation of historical centers. These transformations, which were closely related to the post-war optimism, were a common case in most European countries, but in the Soviet space, war ruins were often used as an excuse for implementing ideological ambitions. Like this example is Vokiečių Street in Vilnius, which was reconstructed in the White Boulevard. These two photos are like from the 40s and the 50s, so some of the cities changed dramatically. In the 80s, one of the features of postmodern architecture, the attention to historical memory, has developed not only as an architectural expression, but also as the development of self-awareness of the wider community and also as self-emancipation of architects. Cultural historians refer to the period as the return of memory, when in late socialism, the policy of glasnost opened the door to the disclosure of previously hidden information and unrestrained discussion of the past. And during the 80s, the return of memory was supported by a network of informal heritage conservation movements with direct interest in history and its cognition through study trips, direct experiences, and contacts. And it also has affected architecture. I'd like to quote historian Salvius Kulevičius, who wrote, "Understanding heritage as a metaphor reached the majority of society, and the heritage protection was turned into means of criticism of the Soviet system." Later, historicism was presented as a foundational principle for people's behavior with heritage. So these tendencies towards historicity in architecture, like the abundance of columns and tablements, arches, and so on, were part of the growing interest in architectural heritage and the question of national identity. And these heritage movements have reached its peak in the late 80s as one of the vectors of Sąjūdis movement, which was a driving cultural and political force to the independence. And here are the photos of the first constitutive meeting in Sąjūdis in favor of preservation of small church, which was planned to enclose by a new building by party committee. And the man at the microphone is Algirdas Kaušpėdas, the architect who has also made his name with several postmodern buildings. So this particular project was suspended and never further developed, and the building materials were donated for rebuilding the church. So I would also like to mention that the local architectural expression, including postmodernism, have been increasingly often discussed employing the theory of postcolonialism. And as you know, colonial order is based on the unequal relationship built on power. And from postcolonial point of view, postmodern architecture in Lithuania could be interpreted as an attempt to disassociate from uniformity of modernism and to find our own architecture and resist foreign universal functionalism. In terms of symbolic geography, architecture has found its inspiration in the past, which was considered culturally superior to contemporary forms. And postmodern architecture in Kaunas, the second city in Lithuania, might be distinguished as a special case, which besides other influences has invoked the authentic historical legacy of the city, that of mid-war modernism that has been recently inscribed in the UNESCO tentative list. For instance, this apartment building on Maironio Street resembles the headquarters of Lithuanian Bank on the same street, mimicking its monumentality, the same color and the texture of the facade. And another example, building of Alytus town municipality, some 50 kilometers from Kaunas, designed by Saulius Iškys, features the traditional composition, but also it contains a tower reminding the tower of other mid-war modern building, Vytautas Magnus War Museum. And yet another example, an old photo of a hospital in Molėtai, designed and built by a young architect, Audrys Karalius, which openly resembles the same building, the War Museum, with similar monumental silhouette, restrained proportions, and vertical openings. And an interesting detail of this building, of this particular building, is the layout, its layout of the double cross plan, resembling an ancient Lithuanian coat of arms, which was banned in the Soviet times. And recently the architect has recollected that this design, it's somehow, okay, you can see it, well, it's more or less seen on the screen. Recently, the architect has recollected that this design was intentional, and he has secretly discussed it with the colleagues, which helped him to implement this project. And this is, I would say, is a characteristic example of the late Soviet architectural culture in Lithuania. And I would not go so far as to assert that this was an act of dissidence, but I think it is a perfect case for postmodern double coding, or the architecture which speaks to the elite and the man on the street, or in the case of Soviet environment, holding a concealed meaning to the informed members. During the late Soviet period, the state has tried to control all aspects of life, which has its consequences on public and cultural life and the everyday. So the everyday reality was often characterized by constrained grayness and sometimes by pure surreal dullness. Therefore, in recent political and biographical cultural writings, the term boredom emerges as a way of describing the late Soviet reality. And here are the covers of two recent books which try to conceptualize boredom, late Soviet boredom, from respectively historical and artistic perspective. And the term boredom is used here as an umbrella term containing a number of qualities: routine, repetition, unification, but also the lack of meaning. And eventually, the period of stagnation was really a fruitful environment for all kind of opposing this boredom and all kind of individual, subjective, and experimental architecture. And the architects themselves have confirmed that postmodern period brought some festive, lively, colorful elements back, as this pedestrian street in Šiauliai, which was reconstructed in the late 70s. It was featuring a set of colorful site-specific sculptural elements and murals, and its overall sensibility resembled like Las Vegas, as described by Robert Venturi. And the postmodern period has also introduced elements of postmodern urbanism, as we call it today, though it was not described in this way back then. It was the appraisal of pedestrian streets, human scale, instead of widened monumental totalitarian spaces. And another example of smaller pedestrian street in Kaunas, designed as a series of small interventions like phone booths, benches, street furnitures, and pergolas. And postmodernism tried to bring back some kind of ingenuity of design. However, this ingenuity was certainly different from the Western postmodern manipulation of cultural contexts, since Soviet ingenuity was often based not on excess but on scarcity. So maybe the way I see it, postmodern architecture was a way to oppose monotony and boredom, or even to put it simply, as it was mentioned many times before, for architects to have more fun. And it's another example of square in Šiauliai, featuring a lot of sophisticated reworking of symbolism, offering a complex set of double-coded meanings and metaphors. And this is considered to be the most illustrative case for postmodernism in Lithuania, Žilinskas Gallery in Kaunas. And architects again mentioned that the attempt to create festive, joyful, optimistic spaces. To conclude, while discussing the tendencies of the rustic turn or return to history, I am not asserting that architects were at the forefront of these tendencies, but it rather that architectural culture was part of bigger cultural and social movements. A specific aspect of architectural postmodernism in Lithuania is the synchronicity of global ideas in different contexts. The situation of architects in the late Soviet period could be characterized by the concept of imagined communities, describing architects as separated by the political situation but united by common professional, aesthetic and cultural interests. And again, from a perspective of postcolonial theory, we could interpret postmodernism as architecture of resistance, disobedience, or even dissidence. But the issue of resistance as cultural defiance in architecture is quite complicated, although it may be stated that in the late Soviet period there was some space for a certain dissident practice. I would like to quote Ines Weissman, architectural historian, who, while analyzing such practices in different ideological contexts, stated, during the Cold War, architectural dissent was articulated by refusal to participate in state projects, by subversion of the norms and language of dominant architecture, or by retreat into private domain of paper architecture and clandestine educational practice. So I would say that all these definitions would also relate to postmodernism and the postmodern architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martynas. Is there any question for the speaker? Okay, I have one. Was there any contextualist approach in an urban level? Because you show a lot of buildings in there, but for example in Hungary, in these ages, the contextualist came up with kind of urban rehabilitations and like these topics. Was there any kind of besides these small interventions, what you showed, the pavements and the fountains?
I am afraid that there were only small interventions, so mostly in the city centers, because I wouldn't recall any example of postmodernism in microrayon buildings, for instance. I know that architects were they really tried to, for instance, to introduce not the free plan, but this, as they say, classical plan with regular streets, with the city blocks. But because of this industrialized production, it was never implemented in a bigger scale.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Questions? There is two. Very good.
You mentioned that postmodernism in Lithuania was trying more or less to give an answer to modernism in Lithuania in terms of coining, forming of national identity, or to express it. It tried to express national identity in architecture. But the same argumentation the researcher of modernist architecture in Lithuania have. They argue modernism in Lithuania answered to this neoclassicistic style of Stalin period, and it was an attempt to express national identity in architecture. So I'm a little bit confused.
Well, that's correct. I think that each generation tried to describe its own relation to history and to national identity. So I think it is true by all each and every major movement or tendency in architecture. So yeah, modernists try to represent national identity in one way, and postmodernists tried to express the national identity in other way. But I don't really see any confusion there. I mean, postmodernism was mostly opposed to functionalism, maybe, in Lithuania. But it was like one more way of investigating the cultural climate of the country.
Yeah, I would be interested in the continuities from the 1980s to the 1990s. So did the same architects further develop the ideas brought up in the 1980s? Or is there a certain change or even break in this new post-socialist context?
Some of the architects were quite consistent in their work, and I think there are like 3 works of the same. Well, these architects, the duo actually of architects of Gytis Ramunis and Kęstutis Pempė, have designed this building before, and for instance, this road police building on the right side at the bottom. So some of them, well, I would say in some cases there was some continuity of expression, but as it was said before, some of the architects were even ashamed of the work in the 80s, and when interviewed, they say that, oh, we were young and we didn't know how to produce things and to design things. But yeah, more or less, some of these tendencies stayed, because since this building is finished in 1996, so yeah.
Thank you. Next question.
Just keep on with the previous question of the expressing national identity. What is the Lithuanian in this type of postmodernism, or is there any type of Lithuanian, the postmodernism of the 80s in your country? If it is an expression of national identity.
I would be quite skeptical about aesthetical qualities, and it's hard to describe the differences while looking at the pictures of the presentation, so I wouldn't go as far as to say that there is some kind of Lithuanian postmodernism or Czech postmodernism or other postmodernisms. But I think what interests me most is the social and cultural context of this phenomenon. And that is the most relevant thing that produced this kind of tendencies.
You have shown a few really interesting examples of late 80s buildings which reference the early modernist architecture of Lithuania, especially in Kaunas, which was then the capital of the country. And I was wondering how open this process was at that time, at the end of the 80s. So were the architects at all able to discuss these references to the period of the country when it was an independent country with a different capital?
To discuss with whom?
With the public.
With the public.
Yeah. This reference to that era of the country.
I think it was a lot of these instances are like a subject of this double coding. I guess what is characteristic of Lithuanian postmodernism that I think there was postmodern architecture, but completely without postmodern theory or postmodern discourse, since it was never ever really critically judged or discussed. I mean, there were several publications, but they were like continuing a very official line of argumentation, and we had any scholar seminars or like discussing what kind of architecture should proceed, since I think even this view of the officials was rather ambiguous. And for instance, the Secretary of State Union of Architects, Alexei Ryabushin, could in the same single speech assert that postmodernism is foreign, but then we should be inspired by local tendencies and so on. So it was rather ambiguous, but it was not clearly stated. So the architects had a lot of discussions between themselves, but I think that they didn't have any like channel to disseminate the thoughts to the public. So, well, that's my opinion.
Thank you. We have one more question.
Thank you for your presentation. I would be curious how you perceive or how you would comment or judge the current perception of these buildings, because you showed us this example that was only last year, I think, listed as a protected landmark by PMP, and on the other hand, by the same architect, this road police building was also quite recently demolished, and there were also economic interests, of course, for this demolition, but the main argument was that it was ugly, and the campaign to preserve it took on this argument and said, no, it is beautiful. So what is perceived as ugly and beautiful, is it do you see any criteria, like in the public discourse, for what is preservable and what is not?
The short answer is nobody really cares about the public, but the long answer is I would say that postmodernism in Lithuania or in Germany or everywhere else is, I would say that it is appreciated or not appreciated in the same way. I think we need some layer of history to assess our heritage. So actually I think that modernism or postmodernism is part of our history, but this particular case, the official version of it the official version is in the citation below, but the unofficial version is that this building on the right corner was demolished against the will of the architects and against the will of architectural community. And this mention and inscription in the heritage list was, I would call it a compensation, maybe. So, yeah, it's a difficult question, but I think that maybe the role of architectural lovers, I would say, would be to advertise the postmodernism, that it would become fashionable. Maybe I think the same thing happens with brutalism, which is now being appreciated and became really fashionable. So, but now I wouldn't say that it is somehow treated differently from other periods. So it's just one single example, and it doesn't really mean that it is the best postmodern building in Lithuania. No, it's not.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is no posthumous national heritage protection, so this is the case. Any more question? Then thank you very much for your lecture, and